Welcome to the last academic meeting for February. I'm going to hand over to Professor Duarte now from the Internal Medicine Research Unit. She's chairing the meeting.
Okay, and welcome to the first session for the research slot. And we gave a bit of thought about what we wanted to actually have as this first talk. And so we invited Professor Ruff as the chair of the East Research Ethics Committee. Everyone probably knows Professor Ruff.
I knew that all.
I knew that all the people. Okay. So, as you can see, this is just a little outline of his extensive biography and his involvement in research over the years and his contribution to medical oncology in the country. He wears, and the world, as he reminds me, and the world. And as you can see, he's also been very, very research active, and you'll read in his biography an age index of 43, involved in numerous clinical trials, groundbreaking clinical trials. So he really has been a great spearhead for oncology research and on the continent. But now he's wearing a new hat, and he's chair of the Research Ethics Committee at WITS. So what I would wanted to do is I wanted to find out exactly when he became chair, and it was in the 1st of August 2023. And I like what he said. He says, I envisage ongoing excellence and efficiency in considering the ethics of proposed research at the university that involves human participants. I'm determined to run a transparent and efficient ethics approval process, and I'm open to engaging with applicants to ensure that good quality research continues at WIT. So I think that's a really good introduction. And the reason why I think it's critically important is that so that we all know, and we have a forum to question and engage with the chair and to answer all those burning questions that we all have. So I'll hand it over to Professor Ruff.
Thanks, Raquel. I think those of you that are maybe a little bit older know me from being head of medical oncology from 2000 until 2021. So I have a long involvement and affinity with this hospital and this faculty. But as Raquel said, I have a new hat on. Well, I still have a number of hats, but this is one of the hats that I wear at the moment. And I think Raquel's point now is important. The aim of what we're trying to do is to make sure things are done properly, and there's a lot of things that haven't been done properly, and there have been a lot of problems that have arisen of late concerning research in this faculty, and we have to do quite a lot of work in getting that right. But on the other hand, to try and expedite research. We're not here to obstruct, we have to facilitate and expedite research, and that's why we want to be open and transparent, and that's why anyone who does have any concerns is welcome to contact us, and we will meet with you, either virtually or face-to-face. I always prefer face-to-face because I'm old, but I don't mind doing it on Zoom or something like that, which also works pretty well. And it's become quite a useful way of interacting. And generally speaking, if there's a problem with someone's research application and you meet, you can solve in 15 minutes, which is going to take 2 months of emails. So we want to be open and transparent. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead. I've got a lot to say, but may not say all of it. Just as a background, as well as being emeritus professor in the School of Clinical Medicine, I have an MRC research center called CIRC that will be closing soon after 10 years, involved in colorectal, breast, and pancreatic cancer, chair of the Ethics Committee, and I was chair of the SAPRO, South African Health Products Regulatory Authority Clinical Trial Committee until October last year. I stepped down after 10 years because to chair both is a bit much, and also that it was time for other people to be involved. So how does this work? How do we... That's what happens when you press the mouse. So where must I put it? There. Yeah. Okay. All right, so as a background, and I always like to start with this little cartoon, the most important thing in clinical research is the study participant. And everything that you do in research revolves around the participant and is to make sure that things are done properly. And so around that, you have the investigator or investigators. You may have 1 person to 20 people. You have principal investigators, and you have sometimes co-investigators or sub-investigators, and depending on the study, but that's obviously an important role. If there is a financial component, there's a sponsor or applicant. This may be grant funded, or this may be commercially funded, or whatever the funding comes from. And funding issues are quite important when it comes to research. And as you know, things at this university and throughout the country are on the verge of collapse because Donald Trump has pulled the plug on everything related to anything to do with research or anything else in this country, and that's making things very difficult. But I think it's important that we try and get this right and carry on in a leaner and meaner way than we have before. But I won't go into details now. Then there's the ethics committee, and you have a local ethics committee, and you have what's called the National Health Research Ethics Council that oversees what we all do, and we'll come to that. And then if you're involved with health products, you have to deal with SAPRA, South African Health Products Regulatory Authority. And remember, it's not just medicines. It used to be medicines, but now it's health products, which includes medical devices and kits or IVDs. So it's a lot broader than it used to be. Now, all research must be approved by an independent, either local or national ethics committee, and the regulatory authority when health products are used. Now, in South Africa, all study with human participants must be approved by an independent ethics committee, or IEC. The Americans use the term IRB, Institutional Review Board, which in a way is not an ideal thing because it shouldn't be institutional, it's got to be above that. And everything that is involved with humans and medical has to come through this committee, the HREC Medical, and that is all research from undergrad, from BSc to PhD, even to DSc, as well as grant-funded research, commercial trials, investigator-initiated trials, local and international group studies such as MRC or WHO, as well as anything else that happens. So it's very broad. Anything involving humans has to come through us. And even if it doesn't, we have to still see it for a waiver. So if you have a study that's in the lab where there's no human materials involved, you still have to send it to us so that we can give you a waiver. If you have a study that's in the public domain, like a review of the literature, it still has to come to us for a waiver. We cannot just go ahead and do it. And the idea behind that is to protect people if something does go wrong. Because if you say on your paper that it's been approved by the ethics committee or waiver's been given, makes a difference. Because if it doesn't, if you don't do it, you go and just do your own thing, and something does go wrong, it creates a problem for yourself and also for the university from a reputational point of view. Now, the ethics committees in this country, there are 2 major groups. There's the university-based one like ours at WITS or UCT or others, and there are private ones which have their own problems, but they all fall under the NHREC. Now, the National Health Research Ethics Council, appointed by the Minister of Health, must maintain the quality of all HRECs nationwide. Unfortunately, none of the HRECs really have the adequate capacity to do what they want. They want oversight, they want site visits, they want all sorts of things that are beyond everyone's capability, but it is something that we are working on to try and improve that, because we don't have an inspectorate, we can't go running around keeping an eye on everyone, although we're starting to do that, and it helps a lot having virtual communications where we can, have virtual meetings with people all over. We have brought in one rule, which previously was a huge problem. This ethics committee was giving approval for everything all over the countryside, regardless. And that's not feasible. Anything to do with another university, we cannot touch, although some universities used to come to us, or people at some universities used to come to us doing what we called ethics shopping, because they thought it was easier to get away with paying fees to their own university. Also with private sector research. If it's in Gauteng, it's okay, but there's got to be a proper MOA in place, because ultimately, if there are problems, we have to have jurisdiction and oversight to make things are done properly. So we need a lot more collaboration between NHREC, the HRECs, SAPRA, and all the academic institutions to try and improve this. The situation is far from ideal, and there's quite a lot of squabbling going on at the moment, but ultimately, hopefully we'll get things right. One good thing is that all the HREC chairs, co-chairs in the country are in regular communication. We have a little WhatsApp group and chat to each other about issues that come up, which is quite useful, and everyone exchanges ideas. Yesterday I had an NJAH meeting, and the chair from UCT was there as well. We had lunch together and also caught up on things, and it's very good that there's alignment between the various HRECs throughout the country. Now, there are a number of principles which I'm going to go through quickly because these are sort of fairly self-evident, but just so that you can see them. One is that when you're doing research, the most important thing is to do good and not do bad, or beneficence and non-maleficence. This is an obligation to maximize benefit and minimize harm. And they require that the benefits of harm posed by research, the risk of harm posed by the research must be reasonable considering the benefits. All research must be scientifically sound and ethically sound, and that's very important. And there's one thing I always say is that if you have bad science, it's immediately bad ethics. There have been complaints by certain people in this faculty that we may overstep the mark at the ethics committee because we make comments about the actual research, but that we will continue to do, because if we see things in applications that are not correct, scientifically or clinically or whatever, we will comment on them. And with all due respect to the various faculty and school and departmental postgraduate and undergraduate committee, unfortunately a lot of things slip through that are not ideal. So we will comment if there are things that we consider to be inappropriate. The ethics committee is a very broad committee of 52 members, because there's so much work. I mean, our ethics committee is far and away the biggest in the country. In 2024, we looked at a total of 1,263 applications coming from all over, including anything from a BSc to a PhD to a DSc to international grant funded studies, etc. So it's massive. And we do split the committee's work into two: one that deals with mainly degrees and individual research, and one that deals with more financial related research such as clinical trials, grant funded research, etc., which goes through the Wits Health Consortium. It's the same committee that does both, but we run it differently because the implications, once there's money involved, the implications are different. And unfortunately, if in research, it does involve money. If you don't have money, you can't do proper research, and the money's got to be looked after properly. And that's where the Wits Health Consortium comes in, which has been doing a great job. Obviously, there are major issues today now because of the advent of Donald Trump, but it's something which we have to find our way through. I won't go into all the details because it's quite scary, but the bottom line is that Wits has an advantage compared to other universities, having an entity like that that's able to manage these aspects of research. Other universities like UCT don't have that, and it's actually a shambles. And I mean, I said I had lunch with the UCT chair yesterday, and they try and cover both in one situation, and it's not good because basically the university has no clue when it comes to dealing with finances. And it's quite important that these things are done properly, because we have to make sure that everything is done ethically, the money goes to the right place, nothing disappears, and that there's appropriate funding for things like, the budgets to pay the actual research, but the other issues that people forget about, like insurance. If you're doing research on human participants, you need to have insurance to protect those participants, and things like that have to be managed. A reimbursement of participants. There's lots of financial issues, and that's something that's quite important. Anyway, carrying on with that, we must make sure that everything is done properly and that we try as far as possible not to do harm. But we must remember one thing, that there are certain studies where there is no benefit at all to the participants. And this is particularly in early phase studies, so-called phase 1 studies, and particularly in what we call first in human studies, where most of the participants are healthy volunteers. At the Free State, there's a thing called PharmOps, which does a lot of phase 1 studies, relies on healthy volunteers, mainly students, and they get paid for being part of the research. And there are a lot of ethical issues involved in that, which haven't been well managed in this country. It's something that we need to work on to get it right, because you can't expect someone to go on a study for no reason at all, other than helping mankind. People in general are not that altruistic, but and so there are lots of issues involved. But there is a lot of research that is going to benefit the community or the world, but not people as individuals, and there are a lot of issues around that. There's got to be equity or distributive justice. You've got to make sure that the research is distributed fairly, and it works both ways. You can't do research on a single vulnerable community and abuse them, such as HIV/AIDS, for example. It's got to be, you've got to make sure that it's done fairly, that the participants are not abused. And that was a big problem in the past, especially with what we call helicopter research, where researchers from the north come roaring into Africa, do all sorts of things, run away with the data and get nothing back. That has stopped to a large extent, but that was a problem. So you've got to make sure that the participants are not abused. But on the other hand, you also have to make sure that the participants are not left out. And that becomes particularly important with more vulnerable populations. For example, pregnant women. You can't say, oh, we're just going to do research on pregnant women because they are vulnerable. It's true they are, but you have to find ways to make sure that they are included in research. The same as with minors, and I'll come back to that. Doing research on anyone under the age of 18 or minors, and there's specific obligations on how you do research on minors. Basically, anyone under the age of 18 will need consent from their parent or legal guardian. Sometimes it's tricky because in this country a lot of children, parents are nowhere to be found. But in addition to that, they also have to give what we call assent, where the minor is giving permission. It's not legally binding because consent is a legal document, which assent isn't. And we have two forms of assent. We have one for 7 to 11-year-olds and another from 12 to 17-year-olds, where they have to sign to agree. Obviously, the understanding of a 7-year-old and the understanding of a 17-year-old are not quite the same. So we have to be careful. So it's important that we are doing research in a fair fashion. There's also the issue of autonomy, and basically, anyway, as it goes hand in hand with what I said earlier, anybody who is over the age of 18 is an adult and they are autonomous. They just have to make their own decisions. It cannot be forced upon them. And that can become important in certain scenarios where that doesn't always happen. People who have diminished capacity for one reason or another, and that has to be dealt with. And ultimately, the participants have to make their own decisions, obviously in discussion with their sort of loved ones and what have you, but it's got to be done in an autonomous way. They cannot be forced to do things. And that can be a problem in any scenario, including the genius in this room. If your senior wants to do research on you, you're immediately vulnerable because you're prone to abuse. So any research done by academics on their students has its own issues, and we have to make sure that there are no undue pressures involved in that. The science, as I said, has got to be good, and we have to make sure the science is good regardless, and that is critical. It's a no-brainer, but it often is forgotten. And then there are a few other points. One is the concept of therapeutic misconception. I think it's quite important to understand that, because a lot of people doesn't understand that. And it's a particular problem in this country. If someone's going on a clinical study, especially a randomized study, they cannot be told that the study will make them better. But a lot of investigators do that. And that's what's called therapeutic misconception, because they may benefit, but they may not benefit. To tell someone that they will benefit is actually unethical and unacceptable. There was a recent situation that came up. One of the people in the research office, quite a few of you probably know, Ian Burns, got recent things from a newspaper advertising a study in basal cell carcinoma with some fancy machine that shoots rays into the person's skin. The details weren't very clear. But what this advert did is it had a before and after pictures of the patient's ear and say, look, this is what happens when you put the patient on. This is a trial, but it's showing basically before and after pictures. that are showing that it's definitely going to help you. And that's totally unacceptable. And you have to, participants and researchers need to understand that. Now, there's a particular problem in this country because we do a lot of research where there is a benefit because we don't have access to a lot of standards of care. And so if someone goes on a clinical trial, particularly, and there would be no standard of care that's used here, but going on a trial, they will get a better standard of care, not an investigational product, but a better standard of care than they would get in a normal situation, which is potentially a sort of undue incentive for someone to be in a trial. So in this environment, doing clinical trials especially does attract people because it gives them access to treatment that they would not have got ordinarily, regardless of whether it's a trial or not, because the minimum they'll get will be standard of care or standard of care plus the IP or investigational product. And that's not strictly how it should be done. But unfortunately, in this country, we do that, and we have to do that because it is one way of providing our patients access to treatments that they wouldn't get normally. And those of you involved in clinical research know that we do it all the time. And if you're going to be an absolute purist, you shouldn't do that, but we do encourage that because I think in the context of where we're at, anything we can do to get better access for our patients is appropriate. Now, just swinging away from ethics to regulatory processes, CMJAH is our so-called National Medical Medicines Regulatory Authority. It was founded on the 1st of February 2018 to replace the old Medicine Control Council. And it has two differences to the MCC. One is it's not part of the Department of Health, it's independent, it's a parastatal. It does fall under the Minister of Health, but it has a board chaired by Professor Helen Rees from here, and it has a CEO and it's run independently. And there's been big improvements since that's happened. It also deals with health products, not medicines. So it's a lot broader. So anyone doing research involving a medical device, and the device can be anything from a bottle of eye drops to a radiation machine, they're all devices, they have to also go through CMJAH, and that's often not understood. And there are many committees at CMJAH that deal with all the different things that happen, including registration of medicines, and including research, especially the Clinical Trial Committee deals with clinical trials. There's also even a complementary and alternative medicines committee. There's a biological committee, there's a medical devices committee, and they're all involved in the regulation of medicines and access to medicines in this country. And CMJAH's whole aim is to provide sort of regulation based on the WHO's principle of making decisions based on evidence-based medicine, which I think is another thing lacking at this medical school. I don't think there's adequate training in the concepts of evidence-based medicine. Hopefully that's improving now with the current dean, but it's always been lacking because I think a lot of doctors don't understand what evidence is all about. It's got to be accountable in the public good. We must safeguard against conflicts of interest, and conflicts of interest are a major issue. I'll come back to that later on in questions. I don't want to go into too much detail now, but we have to make sure that the conflicts of interest are managed. In South Africa, we have a very small community, so it's impossible to avoid conflicts of interest, but we have to manage them. And so we have to declare your conflicts, and both at CMJAH and at the Ethics Committee, all the members have to sign a form every year, a detailed form with all the conflicts, and at every meeting declare them. Say this afternoon, we're having a meeting of the Ethics Committee, and a lot of the members of committees are supervising other people's projects, be it masters, MAs, PhDs, whatever. If that happens, that person has to actually leave the room. If it's a face-to-face meeting, or switch off their computer. If it's a virtual meeting, they can't sit there and listen. They have to completely recuse themselves from anything to do with the discussion that's going on. And that's something that we have quite frequently, but we manage it carefully to avoid any conflicts of interest, including perceptions of conflicts of interest, which can be also very important. You have to have good regulatory practices. It's also going to be independent from pressure from the public, commercial pressure, and most importantly, political pressure. During COVID, it was horrendous, the amount of political pressure put on both SAPRA and on the ethics committees from what I sort of always jokingly people in this country who are think that they're above the rules and can do what they like and demand things that are actually inappropriate, and you have to be quite firm about this so that there isn't any manipulation. And politicians, of course, are the worst of the lot. And I mean, during some of the COVID meetings we had about the COVID vaccines, it got quite scary when you had messages coming during your meeting from as high as you could go in this country. And some of the decisions made need to be right up to the president. So political issues are difficult. They come up all the time, and we have to be quite careful about them. Now, just as a quick one, South Africa is part of SADC, which is 15 countries, over 9.9 million square kilometers, and over 250 million people, and that's how far SADC goes. And it's quite important to understand that when it comes to regulation, we are probably far and away amongst the best in SADC. Only 3 of the 15 countries have proper regulatory processes, Tanzania, Zimbabwe, and ourselves, which include an existing NMRA legal framework, performance of full regulatory functions, management information, and HR. So the quality of regulatory authorities on this continent, especially in this region, are lacking. There is a body, however, called Zazibona, which used to stand for Zambia, Zimbabwe, Botswana, and Namibia, but now includes other countries like South Africa, that's looking at harmonization of regulatory processes throughout SADC, but we still have a long way to go. So as bad as things are here, it's a lot worse when you go north of the Limpopo. And we have a duty in this country to try and enhance regulation and research in the rest of sub-Saharan Africa, especially in this region. But that's for another meeting. Good clinical practice. Anyone who does clinical research has to know about good clinical practice. The current guidelines are the 2020 South African Good Clinical Practice Guidelines, which updated the 2006 guidelines. I was part of the team that wrote those guidelines. But, and everything we do has to be based on those guidelines in this country. There are international guidelines, including the Declaration of Helsinki that came out recently, CMJAH's guidelines, ICH, GCP, and WHO. But you must remember that no matter what comes out internationally, the SAGCP takes precedence over all else. And so whatever you do has to be based on SAGCP. And those of you who've done GCP courses, every person who does clinical research has to do a GCP training course. The initial one is a full 2-day course. It used to have to be face-to-face. We now do allow it to be virtually, but it's still got to be live. And you have to do a refresher course every 3 years, which can be done online, to make sure that people understand all the issues of good clinical practice. On the same hand, you also have to do ethics training. The same rules apply every 3 years. And there's a bit of debate at the moment. What's the right ethics training to do? Everyone tends to do this tree training, which is international. And it's not, I don't think it's ideal, but we do accept that for now. But there is pressure coming from NHREC to do away with that and make it more formal with face-to-face meetings. I don't know how feasible that is, but the bottom line is NHREC insists, and they're correct, and we insist that anyone doing research of any sort or involved in research has to do ethics training and to update it every 3 years. Now, when you do clinical studies, one of the important reasons for doing it, or the major reason, is this concept of equipoise. And it's the basis that a clinical study uses randomization of participants because there's a genuine uncertainty about which intervention is better. And that's the justification of the study. And by doing a randomization, you're preventing bias in the allocation of patients or participants and obtaining an outcome that reduces uncertainty. Now, I made a slip of the tongue. I said patients. The right term is participants. It's not patients and it's not subjects. Because not everybody on a study is a patient. And the term subject should be avoided because it implies that they are subservient or that they are under someone's thumb. And so the term that's accepted is participant. I know it's being pedantic, but we do insist on using the term participant. Many studies we see coming, especially from internationally, use the term subject, but that's something that should be avoided. Now, there are many different clinical studies are done. I mentioned this earlier. And just as a little bit of a background, when you're looking more at clinical trials, there are 4 phases of clinical trials. Phase 1, which are basically dose-finding studies. These are done usually in healthy volunteers, except in oncology, because you can't give oncology medicines to healthy volunteers. And now with gene therapy studies as well, you can't use healthy volunteers. And in those situations, you're treating participants who are sort of, have no other options, but generally speaking, healthy volunteers are used. And so there are a lot of issues about it. And the most difficult studies of all are what we call first in human studies. We used to use the term first in man, but the current term is first in human. Some people say I'm being too woke, but that's appropriate. And first in human studies are particularly problematic because of the risks involved. Remember that whatever data you get from an animal doesn't always correlate in human. When you do preclinical studies, you need to have laboratory studies and then animal studies, usually starting off with some sort of mouse or rat, but ultimately you need a non-human primate to do work on. In our case, it would be a vervet monkey. Obviously, you can't do research on great apes because they are endangered, but even then, what happens in an animal doesn't always correlate in a human, and therefore first in human studies are particularly risky, and there's a lot of issues involving them. You then move on to phase 2 studies, which are smaller studies. They're usually single arm, but they can be randomized. There's no standard of care, and the main aim of these is also to look at safety and to look at responses, but they're normally not adequately powered for a sort of overall benefit, such as survival. And then the most common studies are phase 3 studies that everyone knows, that randomize, as we showed before, 2 different groups of participants, or sometimes more. You can have a randomized study of 4 arms, 6 arms, although the more arms you have, the more complicated it gets. And I remember when I was in training 35 years ago, one of my mentors said that when you're doing a study, if you ask 1 question, you get 1 answer. If you ask 5 questions, you get no answers. And so it's important to make sure that the studies are actually reasonable. And we see this problem quite often where studies are done that are too complicated and otherwise become a mess. So it's always important to keep them sort of simple. And then lastly, you get phase 4 studies, which are not really scientific. They're normally required by regulatory authorities. They're usually post-marketing, looking for safety signals. And usually, well, they must be done according to certain rules that CMJAH has. It's got to be a registered medicine, a registered indication, a registered dose, a registered formulation, a registered mode of administration. So if you're going to do a study of that, it becomes a phase 4, it becomes just a notification, not a full approval. But say you want to do a study on a health product or a medicine, and you want to change the dose, high dose, or you want to change the formulation. There's a lot of work today giving medicine subcut as opposed to IV. It's a big area, a lot of money in it for the pharma companies, and also as much participants. But if you're doing a study with the subcut versus IV, that's a proper study, even though the actual IP is registered. And that's just a little cartoon of what randomization is all about. Everybody knows that. I won't go into details. And then sometimes in studies you get something called stratification, where you have subsets, say age. You're looking at participants less than 50 or over 50. What commonly happens in international studies, they compare North America and Western Europe with the rest of the world, which is a common thing, which is not ideal. But remember one thing, when you do stratification, it's got to be done prior to the study. You can't do post-hoc stratification because that's immediately biased. So you have to do pre-planned stratification as to what groups you want to look at. And you've also got to make sure that the study is adequately powered to give you reasonable statistics, otherwise it becomes meaningless. So it's easier said than done, but the whole idea, you stratify your patients in different subsets and then randomize them, and then you can look at your subsets as well as the group as a whole. Now, most studies are superiority studies, comparing a standard of care to a new treatment or a standard of care plus a new treatment. And you want to basically show that there's a risk reduction, usually shown by the hazard ratio, and your hazard ratio should be less than 1. But most times, if it's higher than 0.8, less than 20% reduction in risk, it's not usually that bad. Your confidence intervals mustn't cross 1 and your p-value must be less than 0.05. But we have to be careful because you can have a lot of studies that may be statistically significant, but are clinically not. And that's why it's very important for everyone here, and I'm talking specifically to the younger people, we have to learn to understand statistics. I'm not here to teach statistics now, it can be another time, but you have to understand what studies are saying, because otherwise you can be good, especially by the pharmaceutical industry, come and show you this amazing data with wonderful therapy, how it's going to cure everyone. And if you analyze the data carefully, you'll see that it's not always as good as you may think. And as much as something may be statistically significant, it may not be clinically significant. So it's important to understand that. Another important group of studies are non-inferiority studies. Where you have a therapy you want to compare to standard of care, and you're not going to show it's better, but you want to show it's non-inferior because there are other benefits, such as it's cheaper or it's safer or something like that. And there are a thing called non-inferiority margins, and I'll show you this in this little cartoon here. That line down here, actually, anything on that side of the line would be inferiority study, either the confidence intervals cross 1. Once you cross 1, it's not significant, and that's why you get these non-inferiority points as are shown by B and C. But then there's a delta, usually 0.2. So anything when the hazard ratio is above 0.2, then it becomes not non-inferior. And so it's important. A lot of studies today have been done like that, especially biosimilar studies, to show that treatments are not inferior to standards of care, so that you can replace the standard of care with it, because there are other benefits. And endpoints in studies, there are many different ones. Overall survival is always the gold standard, but there are many surrogate endpoints that have been brought in. The reason for that is that if you wait for everybody to die, or at least 50% of your participants to die, you're going to wait forever. And so many studies use a progression-free counter-treatment failure or biomarker-based endpoints, molecular endpoints, or responses. So the other endpoints are used because to wait till people die takes too long. And it's also important to look at endpoints along the way. And you'll see many studies that have co-primary endpoints. You have 2, overall survival and sort of progression-free survival. There are different terms for that. Just one point about endpoints. There's a problem we see quite a lot with the ethics applications, where people come up with studies with 10 objectives. And that's not appropriate. It shows fuzzy thinking. When you're doing a study, you need to be quite clear in what you're trying to achieve. And the general way it's meant to be done, you should have 1 or 2, or maybe we will accept up to 4, but it's not ideal, primary endpoints. But otherwise, you need to separate out your objectives and endpoints into primary and secondary, because no ways can you have a study where there are 10 primary endpoints and those are all what you're trying to do. If you want to do that, you should be doing more than one study. And so it's important when you do this thing is you understand what your endpoints are and what the value of them is, and to divide them to make it sensible. And we do send back, well, we don't reject, but we do send back as concerns people who submit research with multiple endpoints that are all over the place. I know some of the schools don't like that, especially therapeutic sciences always complain when I say that. And so, well, that's not how we do it, but I always strongly believe that if you're not focused, it shows that you're not going to get proper answers to your research. I'll miss that. Skip that. Now, let's look a bit at participants in studies. How do we get patients or participants? You see, I've made a mistake here. But patients should be participants onto a study. Remember that no study-related activities can be performed without the signing of informed consent by the participant or their legal guardian. And that's important because many people are not able to sign themselves. I spoke about assent, and I spoke about the so-called pill icon, the patient information leaflet informed consent document. Sarah's arrived, who's part of the ethics committee, so she can also make some comments when we finish. These documents are very important that explain to the participants what it's all about. And in fact, sometimes it's worthwhile that they should take it home and discuss it with friends. Now, it's also tricky, these documents, because some of the ones we get are far too long and complicated, but you still have to explain things. We brought in a rule that 25 pages maximum, generous, because I mean, we've had with some of the farmer studies, the worst we had was a 59-page document. There's no ways that you can expect any participant to read and understand a 59-page document, because what they do is they cut and paste from the protocol into the document. And so we've clamped down upon that, because people need to apply their minds when they do these things. And you can't, it's unacceptable to expect participants to understand complicated documents. I think even 25 pages is being generous, but that's where we are at the moment. The consent and also the assent should be witnessed and dated. And in fact, the time as well should be put down to prevent someone from signing the witnessing before that person signs the consent. So a lot of them do insist on time as well, although not all do. And the participant, they must know about all the risks of what's going on. And then there's this issue of compensation, and that's quite important, because if you're on a study, there's a risk of harm, and there has to be compensation should be available. And it's quite a complicated issue. We follow the so-called ABPI guidelines, Association of British Pharmaceutical Industry guidelines from 2014, that provide for compensation for participants on clinical trials and on any clinical study where there's a risk involved. They're not always followed. The Americans don't. Each state does its own thing. It's always difficult dealing with the US for many reasons, but these guidelines basically say very clearly how participants who have harm should be compensated. The issue of translations is a very tricky one. Ideally, in South Africa, we should translate without documents, but it's not really feasible. We have 12 official languages. There's no ways that you can translate documents into every language. First of all, there aren't people around to do these translations into some of the less well-used language. And also, it's extremely expensive. You have to have a formal translator. It's a formal process where you translate the documents, and then that translated, and make sure there's no difference. It has to be done by a professional translator. It costs you at least 30,000 rand per document, which is hugely helpful. So, in theory, we should be doing translations. In practice, it doesn't happen, but it's something that we need to think about. The other important thing is community. This is not so much for the type of stuff you do, but involving research groups, a lot of exactly this university, where they do a lot of research in the community, and you need to engage with the community. The community needs to understand what's going on. There was a huge debacle recently on the vaccine study. One of the mothers of a child who was on the study went on social media complaining that the child had been vaccinated and died. Now, we don't know all the details, but it obviously created a massive hullabaloo. The Limpopo Health Department got involved. In fact, this was banned from being researched in the province for a while because of this as well as other reasons. It's out now. But one of the big problems is that the researchers do not engage with the community, because a lot of the problems that turned out came from community leaders who complained that this was being done without their knowledge, and therefore they got angry about it. So it was a real messy situation, which could have been avoided if there was proper communication. And this is also an example of what happens in this multicultural, multilingual country we live at. Because in Polokwane, most people speak Sepedi. And one of the big complaints of the participants is that the investigators only spoke Zulu. So it is very complicated dealing with things like that. And the more you engage, the more people are involved and understand, the better. So it can be a minefield, but there's if you take heed to what the issues are and you take the appropriate measures, it can expedite a lot of what we're doing. Vulnerable participants, and I think I'm going to stop after this, just to emphasize this issue about vulnerable participants and coercion. There are many different types of vulnerable participants. I mentioned minors, I mentioned women, especially pregnant women. Elderly persons are vulnerable, people with intellectual incapacity, people in dependent relationships, especially when you have certain environments where the husband tells the wife what to do. That person is particularly vulnerable. If they're highly dependent on medical care, if they have visual, auditory, and mobility impairments, inmates or offenders or prisoners, whatever you want to call them, are automatically vulnerable because they're under the control of the prison authorities. And basically anyone in a subservient position, including, as I said, students. One other is the military. Soldiers fall under a hierarchy. During COVID, there was a situation where the SA didn't want to do a study was observing using empirical health, which is COVID. They needed Cuba. So they thought the way they could get around it, because they weren't allowed to do it, was to do it on time. It didn't happen because they didn't know what they were doing. But one of the things I raised when we met with them was, how are you going to do a study on soldiers? They are subservient to our nation. They didn't like that, but the reality is that's something that you have to be careful with. And you have to take into account the vulnerability of participants. Oh, and just, yeah, this one I just want to do quickly is the thing about reimbursements. It is important that we do reimburse participants on studies. Now, people don't like that. Don't to do that. But there is a principle that SACA developed called TIE, which stands for time, inconvenience, and expense, which is basically reimbursing or remunerating participants for coming on a study, to reimburse them for their costs, the time taken, get from their home to the center, legal tax in their home, the costs of their taxi or the cost of the meal, etc. The current figure is 400 rand per visit, which comes from 150 rand per visit in 2003, which by inflation is now 450 rand, and it's sort of based on this principle. Now, not everyone can afford it, but it is important to try and reimburse participants for their efforts. If it's an inpatient, it's different because a lot of the expenses are not there, so an inpatient reimbursement is probably half of it. But it's important that we make sure that participants are not disadvantaged financially if they need to study. And there's a lot more, but I'm going to stop now because time is marching on, and let Raquel come back. Thank you.